Hey guys, welcome back to the Sheol Podcast. If you're tuning in today, you're in for a great episode. We are speaking with Dr. Marjorie Woollacott. Dr. Woollacott is an emeritus professor of human physiology and member of the Institute of Neuroscience at the University of Oregon. She's also written a book called Infinite Awareness that I would highly recommend. And today's episode has plenty of really valuable insights as to why this research and this changing view of consciousness matters. So let's get into it.
So I just want to start by asking you what your background was, how you became interested in neuroscience and human physiology and that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, that starts way, way back. So first of all, I should say that I did my PhD in neuroscience, and I did that, by the way, after a degree in music. My bachelor's degree was in music, and I always knew that I liked music, but I realized that my real love was for understanding the brain and how the brain creates this phenomenal reality for us. So I went ahead and got my PhD and then began doing research. And I should say that in graduate school, all of my professors said the brain produces consciousness, and that's just a given fact. And so you just need to accept that when there is any problem with the brain, consciousness will be basically either deteriorating or it will be destroyed. And so I thought, well, why don't I, knowing now that fact from all my professors, go into rehabilitation medicine so I can at least help people if they have problems with, in my case, it was with movement control. It was people that have Parkinson's disease or stroke or old age, and they're losing their ability to balance and walk and do things like that. So I did research in that area and had grants from the National Institutes of Health and wrote over 200 papers. I became very well known in that area. But my real love was really understanding consciousness and what is the real nature of consciousness beyond just the interactions with the neurons in the brain that appear to create consciousness in many situations. I felt that there was something more than that. And one of the reasons that I felt there was more than that is that when I was in my early 30s, I had an experience in a meditation retreat where I had an experience of an awareness that felt like it was much more than just my individual awareness in my mind-body complex. It felt like it really expanded beyond me, and I felt a connection with everything around me. And with that initial experience in my 30s, I said, what could that be? And is there a way maybe to understand something about consciousness that's more than what I originally thought it was, just the product of the activity of neurons in my brain? So what happened is that toward the end of my regular career at the University of Oregon, where I was a professor, I began to add in graduate students who were interested in the nature of consciousness and interested in meditation, interested in things like Tai Chi, and trying to really understand what was something extra that I was ignoring when I was just looking at the neurons producing activity in the brain. And then when I actually also started wanting to teach courses about this, I taught a course in complementary medicine. And I said, wait a minute, all of you pre-med majors, it's great that you're learning about pharmaceuticals and surgery and things like that, but what if there are other factors that contribute to our health and well-being? And maybe they're related to, in fact, some sort of energetic factor that we haven't really explored very much in regular medicine. And so we began to actually, in those courses, look at alternative forms of meditation, complementary forms of medication, medication. And we looked, in fact, at things like Reiki healing, meditation, acupuncture, and the students were actually amazed when they looked carefully at the research that is out there on things like acupuncture, on Reiki, that shows that, in fact, they're quite effective, and that people from Yale University, Harvard, Stanford University, the top medical schools in the country, are beginning to do research in these areas. And so with that, I said, hey, I want to really go into this more deeply. So I then retired from my regular activity at the university, and I began doing research now on the origin of consciousness, asking whether it could be more than just the product of neurons in our brain. And that then included beginning to do research with people like Bruce Grayson, who I really respect and love dearly, because we have that same interest as people with a medical background saying, this is interesting, but it's not enough. And I want to know if there's something more that helps explain what I would call anomalous phenomena that can't be explained by just the brain producing activity. And that's when I began doing research, for example, on terminal lucidity that we'll probably talk about today, near-death experiences, things like after-death communication from a loved one, or communication that appears to be telepathic when a loved one dies, hundreds of miles away, and how we know about that. How would we change our theories about consciousness to be able to include that along with our normal perspective from a materialistic neuroscience point of view?
Wow. And that brings up a lot of questions on my end. I want to first just, before all of this, before you had this meditation experience, before you studied neuroscience, did you have any background at all? Were you an atheist? Were you religious? What was your background in that respect?
Good question. So I should first say that I do remember two interesting things from when I was 4 years old. When I was 4 years old, I suddenly realized that this incredible existence that I was in right now on this earthly plane was going to end. I saw that there was death in the world. And at 4, I go, oh my goodness, this was the worst trick somebody could have played on me. Whoever this creator was, to actually put me into paradise and then take it away from me. So I remember that first moment of awareness. But then I also remember not too long later when I was talking to my older sister. So she was about 8 and I was about 4. And I was saying to her, if some sort of divinity, God, whatever exists, then that's a really important thing. And we should dedicate our lives to understanding what that is. What is God if God exists? So I think those two things were going on in my mind from the time I was a little kid. So that's the start. And then I would say that I was raised in a regular Protestant family, and being a scientist by inclination, as I was going through high school and then early college, I could not accept the truth, quote unquote, the dogma that my own affiliation with Christianity was giving me, because it didn't jive with what I was learning in my neuroscience and biology courses. And so at a certain point, I said to myself, I have to make a decision, and I'm going to make the decision towards saying, I want to be honest with myself. And my honesty has to tell me that I can't believe in an ultimate reality when all of my neuroscience courses have said otherwise. So at that point, I put aside all of that upbringing that I had in my own family until I guess it was 1976, when I was about 30 years old. I went to a meditation retreat that my sister had invited me to and had given me to as a birthday present. And in that retreat, a meditation master came around saying that he was going to initiate people in that retreat. And I'm a scientist at that point. I was a young professor in Virginia, and I was skeptical, but I was curious. And what happened is, when he came around to each one of us in the room, he came and he touched me between the eyes and on the bridge of the nose. And I literally felt, though my eyes were closed, I was totally aware that something that felt like a current of electricity went from that place between my eyes down into the center of my chest. And then it stopped in this place equivalent to the heart. And it felt like it wasn't my physical heart, but it was a subtle heart. And I could feel this incredible love and joy expanding outward from that place. And the words that came to my mind were, I'm home. I'm home. My heart is my home. And it was, I feel that same place like right now. It was like this whole new truth of experience came to me that said, wait a minute, this is what you didn't know before. And now you understand something beyond what you learned as a young neuroscientist. And that's when I began to say, wait a minute, I have to explore a little bit more about reality. And I began then to actually, as a young neuroscientist, to begin to do research and look at the research that was out there on things like near-death experiences. And of course, I was shocked that there are wonderful studies out there that show that there's no other way to explain the phenomenon of a near-death experience except to say that consciousness exists apart from the activity of neurons in the brain. As you know, talking to Bruce Grayson and others, when the brain is flatlined, basically the EEG is showing no activity, still the people are aware not only of what's going on in the resuscitation room in the hospital, but they're aware of things going on down the hall. They're seeing things from outside their body, things that cannot be explained from a neuroscientist perspective like myself. And that's when I said, okay, no, I really have to do research in this area. And that's when I began collaborating with people like Bruce, Michael Nahm in Germany, Chris Rowe in England, a number of other people in the United States, because my heart now said, I have to understand what's going on and I have to share it with other people.
Well, I love that you accidentally gave us a plug, because we get to speak to Michael Nahm next
Wow.
month. So that's going to be exciting. Yeah. A little bit of a time difference, but it's going to be fun. Let me ask you this, because I know a little bit about you, because we had the research team look into you before we talked. And you seem to be an advocate of filter theory and the way that Dr. Grayson is. Can you maybe tell our audience why that's the case, and then explain filter theory from your perspective?
Yes, and I want to first mention that filter theory was actually first thought of certainly in the 1800s, and that was by William James, who we have to remember was really the father of modern psychology at Harvard University. And he was one of the people, along with a few other well-known psychologists from Europe at the time, that said, wait a minute, when we look at the brain and we look at the amazing phenomenal experiences that people can have, you can't really explain it from the brain truly being the sole producer of consciousness. He said, I believe there must be something that's more like a filter theory, and that the brain is more like a what they would call a transceiver, meaning a transmitter and receiver of consciousness to other entities in the universe, which would include other people in the universe, other plants, etc. But that there has to be something more than just an individual brain and a mind and thoughts created by that brain that only communicate through the five senses. That's just, he said, there has to be more. And so when he did that, then other people began thinking about that as well. And I should mention that Frederick Myers was one of the people again in Europe. Henry Bergson was another. And what was interesting is that was a relatively popular way of looking at the brain through the end of the 1800s. And then something happened in the early 1900s where our materialist mentality took over again our scientific culture. And that's when the medical schools and the American Medical Association began, in fact, saying, look, we have to take this materialist phenomenological mentality, because, in fact, you really can't show definitively that there is a consciousness beyond the brain. And so they actually narrowed us down to just looking at things like stimulus, response, activity in the brain, et cetera. And that's then what created our modern way of looking at the brain and neuroscience. But more recently, what happened is that people like Bruce Grayson and others who had began looking at near-death experiences said, we shouldn't have thrown out the baby with the bathwater in a certain sense. We shouldn't have thrown out really these wonderful theories of William James and others that were very prevalent in the late 1800s. And so what Ed Kelly, now at the University of Virginia, along with Bruce Grayson, has been doing is writing books like Irreducible Mind, which I read and actually loved, to say there is so much evidence that supports the brain as a filter. So again, getting to the idea of a filter, it's that, first of all, we change our understanding of the nature of consciousness to say consciousness is not simply a material reality created by the activity of neurons in the brain. We are saying that consciousness is actually fundamental to the universe. And that means I use the term primary. It is the thing from which material reality actually condenses down into vibrationally lower and lower forms until it turns into something that feels concrete in front of us. So that's the fundamental shift in our understanding. And if you then say that consciousness is fundamental, what you can say then is that everything in the universe actually is part of consciousness. When consciousness actually condenses, crystallizes into material reality, it takes its own nature of awareness with it. So that everything, you and me, plants, animals, etc., all have as our essence consciousness as our true nature. And therefore, it means that we, in fact, can communicate with each other because we are part of this infinite awareness. But here's the trick. When you become an embodied human being or animal, you end up contracting down to a single point of consciousness. And that's the key thing. You now are no longer able to actually see and experience the vast infinite awareness that's all around you, because now you have crystallized down to one point. And that means that you only see the world, typically with all of our filters in our brain, with our five senses, et cetera. Now, the interesting point, though, that near-death experience research and deep meditation research, et cetera, is showing is that those filters in the brain, and I'll just name some of them quickly to us. It's our five senses filter out a vast amount of the vibratory information coming into us. There's something called the default mode network, our mind-wandering network, which is our egoic way of structuring our understanding of our role in the world compared to everybody else. That's in 5 different parts of the cortex. There is, in fact, there are the left hemisphere language centers, which in fact make us see the whole world in terms of conceptual reality and concepts instead of a wholeness. And it goes on and on and on, all of these filters in the brain. When those filters are turned down in deep meditation or in taking neuromodulatory drugs like psilocybin, or turned off in near-death experiences, the filters then no longer block our wider perception, and we begin to see a wider interconnected reality. And that's when people begin to have those experiences of a connection with a loved one who is dying across the world. Or, for example, a feeling of their oneness with the universe. Or, as some people say when they have taken psilocybin, a feeling that they know what it's like to be all the insects and the plants in their garden. I think that Michael Pollan said that when he had psilocybin. So what we're saying is that this theory explains so many things that the materialist bottom-up theory, the brain creates consciousness, cannot explain. So we like this top-down theory of consciousness actually being the creator, the producer of these vibrational the realities that feel like concrete material reality.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation. And it seems the science seems to be adding more support to this theory,
Absolutely.
right? Because, from the time that we started looking at the brain and what happens on psilocybin, for example, where the expectation was that a lot of the brain would be lit up, and you start to see that that's not the case.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, because if you don't mind, I had heard you previously talk about Dr. Bettina Payton's near-death experience. Can you tell our viewers, our listeners, why that particular near-death experience is so significant?
Yeah, so first of all, she was an MD when she had her near-death experience. She was basically undergoing a cesarean section during the birth of her third child because there were complications with the pregnancy. And in fact, I think the placenta was covering the birth canal, and that is a high risk for bleeding and for the mother and perhaps the baby dying. And so they decided to do a cesarean section. She was an atheist. She was brought up in an atheistic household, MD. She was married to a man who was also an atheist. So she had no expectations about anything happening during that surgical procedure. But what happened is that when they were trying to do the C-section, her heart stopped. And as she said, she had been put under anesthesia. Her eyes had been taped shut so that they always do that to protect the eyes during anesthesia. And yet all of a sudden, she said when she heard the anesthesiologist talk to the surgeon, and he said, "How far along are you on the delivery?" And he said, "It's because her blood pressure is plummeting fast." And he was really concerned, obviously. And then suddenly he says an expletive, and he says, "Oh my God, her heart has stopped." And she said, just at that point, she feels this hollowness in her chest, and she knows that her heart has stopped. And she said, at that point, her own awareness begins to slip out of her body. And she says she goes, in fact, she says, it actually feels like she is going to the backmost part of her mind, and she's like moving backward in what she calls a graceful backward arc into the unknown, into this sparkling blackness. And she says, in this sparkling blackness, she felt an intelligent, pulsating power, as she said. And she felt totally at home, totally ecstatic. And she said she could sort of be aware of this tiny little flame way, way off in the distance that she saw was Bettina Payton's life. But it was not her, that she was this much vaster consciousness. And she was like reveling in this incredible sense of peace and joy when she heard these words from this power. She said almost more like a vibration than words, which is, "You must live." And with those words, she felt herself spiraling downward now, back into that resuscitation room of the hospital, the operating room, just to see the code team come through the swinging doors to try to resuscitate her because her heart had stopped. And she said in that moment, she was above her body watching. And she saw, first of all, this lifeless body on the table that she realized was her. And she was, in fact, a little bit embarrassed about the fact that she looked so dead. But she said at that moment, she saw a senior surgeon walk into the room and weave his way through the crowded people there, come up to her right side and reach into her blood-filled abdomen, find the aorta, clamp it shut between his fingers and his thumb. And she said, suddenly she felt energy like moving into her body, like something had happened, like her body was like alivened again. And with that, her heart began to beat again. And they tied that off. And she said, at that point, she began to go, she went back into her body. And she said she could actually feel then all the pain once she was back in her body. Now, she said at that point, she heard a doctor whisper in her ear that she had a little girl. The girl was fine and healthy. And she said, when she then came to again in the recovery room, she was surrounded by the team of doctors and her husband, who was also a doctor. And she said, before they could say a word, she had a trachea tube in her mouth, so she couldn't speak. She motioned to have something to write with. And they gave her a pen and a napkin. And she wrote on the napkin words to this effect: "I know my heart stopped. I know my uterus is out," because they had to do a hysterectomy. "And I know I have a baby girl," because she wanted them to know that she knew everything that happened in the operating room. And she said, from that point of that experience, I had no question that consciousness is fundamental and that I am consciousness. So the beauty of this is that, first of all, she shifted her worldview immediately. And secondly, she changed to doing hospice care as a physician after that, because she said when she shifted to hospice care and she walked into a room with people who were dying, they could feel her lack of fear. And everything in the room changed when they knew that she wasn't afraid. Therefore, they didn't have to be afraid. So I think that is a powerful story about that transformation completely from really materialist to post-materialist, and how that changed her life and the way she treated everyone else in the world.
Yeah, and I think I was going to ask if she had mentioned struggling with that change, but it sounds like more of an epiphany moment, like she saw something she didn't say.
You're right. But I do want to mention one thing. Her husband was still an atheist, and I think he's pretty much still an atheist to this day. They're still married after all those years. And everyone around her felt like she had had a hallucination. But she said right after that experience, she knew she had to get back to that near-death experience and experience it one more time again. And she had an intuition that meditation might lead her there. And that's when then she began to explore meditation. She originally didn't find a meditation path or tool that worked for her, but then against, I think, her husband's and her friends' wishes, she had heard about a meditation teacher in the Catskill Mountains of New York at an ashram there. And she felt she had to go to find out if that might help her understand. And she said, I was crying all the way there because I felt I was insane. Why? My family thought I was crazy. But she said, when I got there, and she said, I went to this first morning chant with this meditation teacher. She said, I went back into that experience of absolute oneness. As I sort of merged with her and she merged with me, I found that place again. And I knew that I could get there again through going into meditation for quieting my mind. I was back in that place. So you're right. She did struggle. She knew what she was looking for, but it took her a while to let go of all of the angst about the society around her, and then finding a way back through meditation. And to this day, she now meditates every day regularly and believes that is really the way she has reconnected with that experience.
Well, I want to come back to meditation because I know that's a big part of research you've done and conversations that you're involved with. But I wanted to ask you on the topic of terminal lucidity. We have early on did an episode about children experiencing terminal lucidity. And I know that you've been involved in that type of research. So I wanted to know if there was anything you studied or encountered, experience in that research that you found particularly compelling you could share with us.
Yes, and I should say that, in fact, I've just written with Natasha Tassel-Matamua a chapter for a book that will end up being coming out in France, in Switzerland, but they took our English chapter, they'll be translating it into French, and I think that we found some very, very important things, and I just want to mention a few of them. Here is just, I'll give you a few of the samples of some of the experiences and then some of the data that we've now quantitatively analyzed. So here is one, in fact, from a woman who actually I'm going to be seeing tomorrow because she's my hairdresser. I just want to mention anecdotally that doing terminal lucidity research, I tell everybody I meet that I'm studying terminal lucidity, and I say, have you had anything like that happen to you? Have you witnessed that? And of course, I'm amazed at how many people say yes. So that's what happened. She was doing my hair, and I said that to her, and she said, oh, yes. And I said, well, would you fill out the questionnaire that we have now? And I will be happy to send that to you so you can pass it on to the people that view it. And this was what she said about her own experience. She said her youngest brother had kidney failure starting at birth. And she said by the age of 16 years, his body was growing more weary from that battle with his kidney failure. And she said he had had some seizure episodes, and then one day he started to have a seizure that went on for multiple hours. And then he went into a coma. And she said the ICU doctor said if and when he could come out of the coma, there would be so much brain damage from the seizures, he would most likely be in a vegetative state. So 1 week after going into the coma, he returned to his waking state, and he appeared to have his full consciousness back. Now, their parents and the medical staff were completely taken aback by that clarity. And in fact, he managed to become well enough to get out of the ICU and onto the pediatrics floor in the hospital again. But then that following evening, she said, she's just his older sister now, she said, I went to his bedside to visit him, and I was telling him that it would soon be time for him to go home and see his cats and some of the things that he enjoyed at home. He didn't look me in the eye, she said. He looked down at the foot of his bed and he said, yeah, I have a feeling I'm going to get out of here soon. She said, my mom received a phone call later that night, and he called to talk with her, and during the conversation, he asked her about each and every member of the family and how they were doing. And he had a special nickname for her mom, and when he went to hang up the phone, he said, okay, goodbye, sugar. And inside a couple of hours, the hospital called to say he had transitioned. So once again, vegetative state, nobody thought he'd come out of the coma, comes out, says goodbye to everybody in that way, and dies a few hours later. So those are the things that we saw over and over again. And I'd say in our children's study, we have like about maybe, I think, 15 children so far. And this is the one that it's harder to find people that have experienced terminal lucidity in children. It's much more rare because of good news is that less children die in those ways. But we would love to hear more of those experiences because what we're learning it means is that if we can really educate hospital staff and also parents about this phenomenon in children, they will be less likely to keep on using these incredibly severe resuscitation procedures into the last moments of a child's life to give the child a chance to be at home with the children, whether it's in the hospital setting, but be with the parents and the children together so that they can say goodbye in a lucid way together if this terminal lucidity can reemerge. So I think that's one of the exciting things. I can certainly share a few other stories about those if you want to hear them.
Well, I do want to hear another story if you have something you could share. But I wanted to, what you said just now is something I haven't heard a researcher say yet. The idea that, well, let me ask you this way. Do you believe if we did take that approach, we would get this type of terminal lucidity experience in most cases?
When you say most cases, I don't know about most cases. That's an interesting question because I'm just going to take you one step back to near-death experiences. Some people ask, why is it that only in 10 to 20% of the cases, depending on the study, people remember this awareness during cardiac arrest? And I want to say that, first of all, I just submitted a study to the journal Explorer about a woman, Stephanie Arnold, who had a near-death experience during the birth of her second child, but did not remember it until she went under hypnotherapy afterwards a few months later. And then everything came back. And now there are a couple of articles out there in journals showing that hypnosis actually can bring back memories of a near-death experience that had been basically suppressed, forgotten right after the experience. And it could be that they're suppressed or forgotten partly because of the anesthesia. I mean, we're put under deep anesthesia. So there's an interesting question right there. If you could put more people under hypnosis, would they remember near-death experiences? But then we're thinking now about these cases of terminal lucidity. If we gave these children who were now in the dying process the opportunity to be off all of the emergency procedures, getting the heart going again, all of the sorts of things people do, and allowed them to quietly be with their family, could they then come out of coma and then say goodbye to their family in a beautiful way? And I think what I'm saying, in fact, is that if you look at most of the stories now that we have collected, that seems to be the case, that in those last hours to maybe day or so of life, if the child has been in a coma and the parent and the hospital team finally say, we've done everything we can for this child's life, we're now going to put a do not resuscitate command in effect. The child then comes out of coma and the child says, I love you so much. I'm going to be going home now. And the child dies. So to me, that says that, in fact, it's almost like the higher spirit of that child says, I can come out of coma now because they're going to let me just say goodbye and pass. And because so often those last moments with the child are basically, that way, I think that's really true. I think that somehow the child needs to know that the family is okay with their dying. And when the family's okay with their dying, then they can come back to say goodbye to the family in a lucid way and leave.
Do you have any other stories that you found compelling in terms of the pediatric?
Yeah.
Because I know, like the pediatric, the oncology study, you were a part of that,
yes,
right?
Definitely. So and just maybe again, taking a step back, what happened is that the way that whole team got created is that I had been talking with Bruce Grayson about, of course, near-death experiences and other things. And I emailed him to say, Bruce, I really want to study terminal lucidity. And I said, it would be wonderful if we could start a collaboration. Well, amazingly, Michael Naum, who he had previously collaborated, was actually thinking the same thing. And he said, well, why don't we include Michael Naum? And I said, great. And then Natasha Tassel-Matamua from New Zealand had emailed Michael Naum to say, I really want to study terminal lucidity. And I said, hey, let's create a team. And as we created that team, then Bruce mentioned, well, Philip Roars, who's on our hospital staff, I know has seen at least 3 cases. So that allowed us to create this team to start studying them. And so our first paper was on Philip Roars' 3 cases that he had witnessed himself that were very powerful. And so then we wrote that case study, which then you have read. And then we, as a team, applied to the Bial Foundation from Portugal to actually do our own study on terminal lucidity in children, and then extended that to adults. So I'll give you then a few of the cases from then this study that we now are in the process of doing. So here's one more. And this is from, I believe, a social worker who was interacting with children who were dying. She said, on the 28th, Maggie lapsed into a semi-comatose state, and she was mumbling in her sleep. She said her parents and younger brother remained with her. We brought in lounge chairs and food for them. I met with the little boy to see how he was doing and to give the parents a break. That evening, Maggie, his sister, came to alertness. The nurses reported that she told her parents not to worry about her, as she had seen another child who had died a short time before, and the child would be with her. The nurses reported that Maggie was alert, spoke clearly, and seemed at peace during this time. She died within an hour of becoming alert. And the mom later told me that Maggie had seen that deceased child at a funeral service for another pediatric patient at the hospital. Maggie told her mom that the deceased child was sitting in a chair that had sunlight beaming down on it in that room with her. The mom didn't see the deceased child, but Maggie referred to her by name. So once again, the child sees somebody that's going to help her across that recently died, and she is fine, and lets the parents know everything is going to be okay.
Wow. Did you take anything away personally from this research? I mean, I'm sure that's got to have an impact on you in reading these stories.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, what I took away was, first of all, I think why I'm so passionate about it is I want to let the healthcare world and family members know, so that the transition from life to death to the other side is not such a traumatic process. We all have to die. And for some reason, different people seem to pick different exit points from life. And for some reason, for some people, they die early. We don't know why. But even if they're dying early, we shouldn't feel so dismayed when we realize we've done everything we can. The child knows we've done everything we can. And now if we can allow this to be a sacred moment for both the one leaving and for the family and the hospital personnel, I think our healthcare system would be so much more enlivened and radiant in the way they actually took care of patients. So for me, I think that's why it's become such a passionate thing to really want to share with other people around me.
I appreciate you sharing that.
Yes.
Having worked in healthcare myself, I think that's what I've taken away from this conversation so far, is the way that you mentioned we approach death.
Yes.
Because it's not like that. And these not just stories, but the research out there should be affecting the way that we approach these patients, but it really doesn't at this point.
And I want to say, and can I just say two things about that? Because I think it's better than we think. Things are changing. And so the first of all is that when we were interviewing in this long questionnaire, 40 questions, I think, the caregivers or the hospital personnel, and we asked them, first of all, how they would explain the lucid event themselves, because, I mean, that's an interesting question. And what we found, I was happy about this, 17 of those people said they felt that terminal lucidity experience in the child was a spiritual experience. That was great. And they also said that they thought it was an indication that consciousness is independent of brain activity. So that's another really great one. And they also said that, well, only three said they thought it was actually a biological event. So that was really good too, that was caused by brain activity. So you have 16 versus 3. And then the other thing that was interesting is that when we asked how they had been changed by this, I thought it was very interesting that 11 of 13 respondents answered the question that it had made them a more spiritual person. And I thought that was really, really great. And also they said that it had made them less fearful of death. And also that it affected the way they interacted with other people in general. So more spiritual, not afraid of death, interacting with other people, and I'm sure probably a more kinder way, because we know that people can't help where they are often in life, and they're doing their best. And if we can approach people compassionately, knowing that, instead of judging them all the time, that can really help too in what we're doing. So I think it does transform the caregiver like it transformed me.
I want to change gears for a second here. Because you have written a book, Infinite Awareness. I wanted to have you tell our audience what inspired you to write that book. What do you want people to take away from it? It seemed to be pretty impactful, but I'm going to be honest with you, until our research team came to me with you, I wasn't aware of it. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, so certainly. I mean, so knowing now that you've heard about my experience with my meditation awakening, I then went through my years as a university professor from the time I was 30, trying to figure out how I can actually assimilate that experience and create a worldview for myself that can hold my understanding as a medical professional and also my experiential understanding of my meditation experiences and my new understanding about near-death experiences. And so I was thinking, how can I really do this? And so what I decided to do toward the end of my career at the university was to write a book on my own experience. And I'll take a step back. I actually, as a university professor, had sabbaticals every 7 years. And at a university sabbatical, you're allowed to go and do research at other universities. And I said to the staff at my university, look, I've been doing actually my alternative and complementary medicine courses on things like Reiki and meditation and things of that sort. I would like to go to Rochester University to actually take courses in Asian studies to understand the Eastern points of view on meditation and the mind and the brain and spirituality, and also even take Sanskrit so that I can understand these ancient texts on consciousness from the 10th and 11th centuries, et cetera. And they kindly agreed. And so I went to Rochester University, and while I was there taking the courses, I decided I was going to go back and get a master's degree at the University of Oregon in Asian Studies so that I could turn this into a master's thesis. And I did that, went back to the university. So while I was teaching all of my courses in neuroscience, I was also getting a master's degree in Asian Studies, wrote up my thesis, and my master's thesis advisor, Mark Uno, said, Marjorie, you should really turn this into a book. And I thought, wow, I will make an attempt to see if I can do that. And so what I loved is the book's main purpose was to help me put together these two different worldviews, the materialist worldview that I had grown up with as a young scientist, and the post-materialist worldview that says consciousness is fundamental, that I now tended to feel was strong, and I wanted to put the two together. So that book then was really a combination of my own memoirs about what I went through to get to that point, and then all the research I had found as I, with curiosity, as now a scientist, went back and looked at the literature on near-death experiences, Bruce Grayson's work, et cetera. Things like, for example, I think telepathy, for example, all of those things about clairvoyance. What do we know about that? What do we know about energy healing? And I was, of course, amazed at the amount of research that was out there. So each one of my chapters in these different areas, like near-death experiences, cases suggestive of reincarnation, telepathy, et cetera, all give you the latest research that has convinced me that these are real phenomena and need to be included in our current worldview. And then I should mention that as I was getting ready to do the last chapters, I realized I wasn't sure how I was going to end the book. So I had just read Irreducible Mind by Bruce Grayson, Ed Kelly, and others. And I should mention briefly that when we were reading Eben Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven, which somebody recommended to me, and I know he's been on your podcast, my husband had noted that at the very end of the book, he said, if you really are interested in this, read Irreducible Mind. And he gave us how to find it. My husband immediately went out and bought the book, saw that it was 800 pages long, said, too much for me. He put it on my side table. And I ignored it for 6 months because I hadn't ordered it. And then I peeked into it. And as soon as I started reading the first pages, I was absolutely glued to that book because as a neuroscientist, Ed Kelly and others were telling me everything that I knew was true, but hadn't been willing to admit all those years. And so I kept, in fact, tugging on my husband's shirt sleeve, saying, Paul, you won't believe this. And I would read what Ed Kelly or another person had said. So I go then and contact Ed Kelly. And I want to say that unlike many neuroscientists I have interacted with, when I emailed Ed Kelly, he said, oh, Marjorie, would you like to come out? It would be wonderful to have you come out. And we'll even set aside a day when everybody can be here and we can talk with you. Usually neuroscientists are skeptical of each other, competitive. He wasn't that way at all. We had the best 2 or 3 days together. And then I interviewed Ed and others, Bruce Grayson included, and those interviews are in the last parts of my book. And he did say something interesting to me. He said, when I looked at your book, there was one chapter that was missing, according to my beliefs. And he said, I was wondering why. And he said, it was the chapter on mediumship. And I laughed and I said, well, The reason there's no chapter on mediumship is because as a young neuroscientist, I was a little bit leery about what I had heard about sometimes like negative influences coming into somebody when they were using a Ouija board or something like that. And so I was just a little frightened. And so I thought, if I don't believe in it, it can't be real. And he laughed at me, but he then told me about his own experiences and his own research and that of others. And that convinced me to start looking. And there are all the data showing how powerful after-death communication is and how credible it is. And in fact, I now have a paper out with Chris Rowe and others from England on after-death communication in like almost 1,000 people with their loved ones after they've died. So now I have turned into somebody that says this is a really credible and very interesting phenomenon. So that's how the book was created. And I also should mention, I published it with Rowman and Littlefield, which is an academic publisher, which in fact is where Ed Kelly published many of his books. And the publisher just said to me, she said, "What do you want from this book, Marjorie?" And I said, "Look, I don't really expect it to be a bestseller per se, but I would love to be able to actually go to like maybe 3 or 4 conferences a year and talk about these things with others." And in fact, that wish came true. And I have been invited to many, many conferences and onto podcasts like yours to talk with other people about these things. And I feel that in that sense, maybe it's not a bestseller, but it is in fact sharing this knowledge with those people that perhaps are ready to like look at it and understand it, and maybe then share that with others so that we begin to change our worldview in our culture at large.
Yes, I agree that it's very important. No matter how long it takes to get a wide viewership. I think it was interesting. What you said was really profound in the sense that if I pretend it's not there, it's not real. It seems to be that was the way people viewed the religious side, 25 years ago. And it's really flipping because a lot of materialist scientists really don't want to hear, I think, what you guys are saying. And just piggybacking off that a little bit, what areas of research would you like to see explored next, since you've participated in a good variety in meditation, near-death experiences, terminal lucidity? What do you think would be helpful to explore next?
One thing I think we need to like pin down better is what is really going on at this mind-brain, consciousness mind-brain interface. And we really don't know. I mean, what I would say from my own research and that of others is that we do know that when you quiet down all of these networks of the brain that are our filters, default mode network, the language network, et cetera, a parietal lobe is like space and time limitation networks, we do allow a broader awareness to actually emerge. But the question is, what does that mean? It's like if turning down the brain or turning off the brain allows a broader awareness, what is going on when the brain is active at this interface? And we don't understand that. I think it was very interesting in a Scientific American article on terminal lucidity that came out recently. The man was interviewing a lot of people that were doing research, in fact, on this National Institute on Aging referendum for terminal lucidity research in older adults. And they were trying to explain it from a materialist point of view, if they could. And they were saying, well, we know that at the time of death, there appears to be maybe a surge of activity in certain parts of the brain, and maybe that's part of what terminal lucidity is about. But I'm saying, wait a minute. That doesn't explain how with NDEs, when it's turned off from outside the body, you experience these phenomena, often with a 360-degree viewpoint. So I think that it's nice that they have that. I'm not arguing against what these scientists are trying to do, looking at terminal lucidity, but that explains one tiny little bit of what is really going on at the end of life. And we need to understand, not only at the end of life, but during life, how it is that at certain periods, some people, and maybe many people, have heightened awareness, have expanded awareness, they have awareness that couldn't come through the 5 senses. And then say, if it happens outside of the brain, when the brain is turned off, how does the brain then actually retrieve that information into their memory system so that the person has it after the NDE is over with? How does it get in during the death of a loved one that you experience visual expanded awareness, visualization or in a dream, and then find out it was absolutely true. How does that get into your brain? And what is that receiver transmission mechanism that appears to be going on? We have no idea that I know of right now. So to me, that's the next step if we can figure that out.
Yeah. The idea that you would almost like the hard drive on a computer at storing information, but there's an input system kind of. I'm not sure exactly how to explain that. But, okay. I don't want to keep you too long here because I want to be respectful of your time. But I did want to ask you kind of, because you're a big advocate of meditation. Have you seen a lot of what neurological changes does a person go through that are verifiable with regard to meditation?
Very good question. I mean, now there's going to be more and more research on that. And I know that Richie Davidson's lab at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, one of the big groups, at Yale University, they're doing work. Judson Brewer now at Brown University also, they're doing a lot of work in this area. And so the first thing that I can say is that we certainly know that when you're in meditation, what happens is that this default mode network, that is your egoic narrative about who you are and how you relate to the world, turns way down. They put people in a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and they see that those parts of the brain turn blue, which means their activity is lower in the images compared to red when we're really focusing on our role in the world and interacting with others. So clearly that network goes down. Also, the parietal lobe, which is the part of the brain, interestingly, that is helping us orient in time and space, goes way down. And in those meditation experiences, then we have experiences beyond time and space. We feel infinite and we feel eternal. It's as if all of time came down into the present moment, for example. And so there are places in the brain that are very clear that turn down with these deep places in meditation, and also, of course, with psilocybin experiences, et cetera, because they are very similar when people look at psilocybin and with meditation. The next thing I think that's really important is that it's not just that they turn down during meditation, that literally then people are showing that these very same parts of the brain, for example, areas of the amygdala and other parts of the emotional parts of the brain end up being getting stronger and thicker when they are the ones that are actually inhibiting other parts of the brain. So those parts of the brain inhibiting your fear responses, they get thicker. Lots of parts of the brain involved in your executive function get thicker. So we're showing that, in fact, you get a stronger, quote unquote, brain muscle to inhibit your reactivity so that you can pause in the moment and see what's the best thing to do out of compassion for others. So there we see permanent changes in the brain. And I think that the point that we're seeing is that something happens to us where we begin to feel more compassion for ourselves and others. And again, that's a lot of what Richie Davidson is beginning to do himself at the University of Wisconsin, showing that this is the case. And it's a wonderful thing to know that, in fact, you can train it. What I love about their own work is they're showing you can begin to train this in preschool and kindergarten, first grade levels, where you give them mindfulness training. And what happens is they begin to be less self-absorbed and less self-centered in their kindergarten and first grade classes, so that they care about other children in the class when they look at their behavior. So I should mention one initiative that I'm a part of right now is what we would call the Consciousness Education Initiative, where we're trying to figure out a way as a group to help change education on consciousness from preschool and kindergarten on up all the way through the university, so that people are given a choice about the different theories of consciousness that are available for them to actually choose from. Right now, in the school system, it's only the materialist bottom-up perspective. And we would love to allow teachers to say, wait a minute, let's look at all the continuum, and then the student can choose from the research data out there which they think fits best with their own experience of reality.
I love that. That would be incredible. Because it seems that the perspective that people have on their lives would be so much more meaningful. You would likely decrease, mental health issues and all kinds of things. if that could happen. So, wow, that's some very interesting things that you are working on. Where can people go and learn more about you and your current research, future research, etc.?
Certainly, there's my website, which is marjoriewoollacott.com, if they can spell my long last name with double letters. But it's right here in front of them. So, except there's 2 C's. That was a mistake. Sorry. So we need to change that.
Oh.
Yes. That would be one of them. And then those people that are interested in research that they might be academics or scientists can go to PubMed and type in my name, and they will see all of these papers on after-death communication, on terminal lucidity, on near-death experiences. In fact, the one on hypnosis allowing near-death experiences to actually be remembered will probably be coming out soon. One on transformations with near-death experiences just got published in Explore. So I would suggest that those papers have lots of personal experiences of the individuals in them. So they're not difficult academic papers. They're meant to really share the true phenomenology of this. So I would say if they have access to the web, go and find those papers. And of course, they can just email me. I am very happy to talk to people interested in these things, especially whether they're students that want to maybe go in and get a PhD in the area or a master's degree, other academics wanting to do more research. This is my passion now in life, so I love doing research together with others.
Well, we appreciate you sharing it. I mean, it's obvious you have a passion for this, and the ideas you're presenting are incredible.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed your input here.
Thank you so much, Justin.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. I'd love, hopefully, to be able to talk to you again down the road.
I'd love to do it, and probably when our studies are over, we'll have a lot more data for you. So
that sounds great. All right. Well, thank you very much.